Okay, so today we're going to be looking at, you can find the y-intercept from a table. Yesterday we looked at graphs and we talked about how that we find that is by looking at where the graph line intersects or touches or starts on that y-axis. It's very easy to see from a graph, and we want to take advantage of that, but you're not always going to have the graph. So what we needed to find out is, how do I find that y-intercept? Where does that line start from, or where does that line cross the x-axis, or excuse me, y-axis? And how do we determine that from the table? So, remember, when we look for a y-intercept, we want to know what is y going to be equal to when x is equal to 0. So that's what we're trying to figure out. So we're going to look at a couple ways to show this. And so one way we can look at it, and always we're going to look at it, the first thing we really have to do is look at what is the rate of change, or what is the slope of this line. And remember, to do that, we want to find the change in y over the change in x. So in this case, I'm looking at, are my y's increasing or decreasing? And in this case, they're increasing by 4 each time. And then on my x's, I have an increase of 1. So when I set up my equation, I get 4 over 1, which tells me slope is 4. So basically what that's saying is, when we look at that, as the x's increase by 1, so as x goes up by 1, my y's go up by 4. So remember, we're trying to get x equals 0. So one way we could do this is, okay, how do I take x back to 0? Well, I subtract 1. So we go back to our relationship that if you increase x by 1, you increase y by 4. Well, if we do the inverse, we decrease x by 1, then we have to decrease the y by 4. And so we would subtract 4 and we would get 0. So we would see that when x is 0, y is 0, this is a proportional table, and my y-intercept would be 0. So that's one way of doing it, with scaling up and down. That's just wanted to show you that, but the way that I'd like to show you, to teach you, is this way. All right, so here are the steps for finding the y-intercept from a table that we're going to use. Like we talked about last time, we talked about scaling back to 0, because remember, we know it's the y-intercept. We want to make sure that x equals 0. That's how we know it's the y-intercept. But we're going to look at it a little differently here. So step 1 is, we're going to find the slope. And so to do that, we want to find the delta y over delta x. So just like we did last time, the slope is going to guide us in the right direction. Okay. So when I look at delta y over delta x, I want to know, well, how much are my y's increasing or decreasing? How much are my x's increasing or decreasing in by? So I see that from 7 to 13, that is an increase. 13 to 19, that is an increase. And 7 plus 6 gives me 13. 13 plus 6 gives me 19. And so my change in y here is a positive 6. The next step, it's obviously going to be, is to find the change in x, right? We've been working this for a while now. So change in y over change in x. So I see that that is an increase of 2, and 3, and an increase of 3. So my change in x here is 3. So now this becomes a division problem, and I want to know, well, what is 6 divided by 3? And that tells me my slope is equal to 2. Okay, so we found the slope, and what we found from our change in y over change in x here is that our slope was equal to 2. All right, so that was step 1. Step 2 now, we need to take the slope, and we're going to multiply it by every x value. So what I mean by that is, we're going to say, okay, well, it's 3 times 2, 6 times 2, 9 times 2. Right? And so when we look at that, we're going to see, when I take the slope and I multiply it by an x, an input of x, does it give me an output of y? So when I say, basically, does 3 times 2 equal 7? So when I do that math, I get 3 times 2 is equal to 6. So it doesn't. But let's keep working our way down. And so I'm going to say, okay, well, 6 times 2 is equal to 12. 9 times 2 is equal to 18. So what I need now is realize, like, okay, well, I have a 6, not a 7. So there's an extra step involved here. I need to figure out, well, what do I need to add or subtract to 6 to make it into 7? So the difference between 6 and 7 is I need to add 1. As we look down the table here, well, to get from 12 to 13, I need to add 1. To get from 18 to 19, I need to add 1. So what we see here is this constant pattern of plus 1. This plus 1 is my y-intercept. So because it's positive 1, the y-intercept here is going to be 1. We call this the extra step when we're looking at the table and the relationships. So this is the y-intercept. So let's go look at another example. All right, so let's look at another example. So I want to know what's the y-intercept of this linear equation, this relationship. So if I graphed it and I drew the line, where's that line going to cross the y-axis at? So remember our steps. The first one we got to do is we have to find the slope. So I want to know what is delta y over delta x. Let's find delta y. So 0 to 12, that's an increase of 12. 12 to 24, also an increase of 12. I'm going to divide that by, when I look at my x's, well, negative 2 to positive 4, that's an increase of 6. 4 to 10, increase of 6. And my delta x is 6. So 12 divided by 6 gives me a slope of 2 again. All right, so step 2 was now let's look at the process. So I'm going to actually redo this table. And when I do that, I'm going to make that middle section here. And in that middle section, I want to know what happens when I take the x and I multiply it by the slope. Does it give me the y? Or am I going to need a little bit of an extra step? So we had negative 2, 0. We had 8. Sorry, that was right. So we had 12, and we had 24. So we know we're going to plug in a 2 here. We're going to multiply by 2. Remember, we call this the process. Sorry, where is that? All right, so when I multiply negative 2 times my slope of positive 2, that gives me negative 4. Remember, I'm trying to get a 0. All right, well, let's look at that. 4 times 2 gives me 8. 10 times 2 gives me 20. So how do I turn a negative 4 into a 0? What do I add to 8 to turn it into 12? What do I add to 20 to turn it into 24? So each of these, we have that extra step of plus 4, plus 4, plus 4. So we see that consistent change of having to add 4 each time. And since it's positive, that makes my y-intercept equal to 4. All right, so let's look at one last example. In this example, let's get the table x. I'm going to leave this for my process, y. And let's say I have negative 3, negative 6, negative 1, negative 2, 2, and 4. So remember, we're still going to follow our steps here. So step 1 is to find the slope. And to find the slope, we want to do delta y over delta x. So change in y over change in x. So my change in y is equal to, well, negative 6 to negative 2 is an add of 4. Negative 2 to positive 4 is going to be a plus 6. So notice we're different here. Okay, we notice we're different with plus 4, plus 6. So we could choose one, but let's look at the other side as well. So let's look at the change in x. So negative 3 to negative 1 is a plus 2. Negative 1 to a positive 2 is a plus 3. So both of these ratios are equivalent, which means that if I took 4 and divided it by 2, or I took 6 and divided it by 3, both of these answers would come out to a slope of 2. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to go look at the process. Right? We talked about process. And what I mean by that is we're going to take the slope and we're going to multiply it by all the x values in the table. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to multiply it by all the x values. So let's plug in a 2 here, plug in a 2 here, plug in a 2 here. So 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. Negative 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. 2 times 2 is 4. So we notice that we did make the output here. Because of that, I need to add 0, add 0, add 0. So because we're not adding anything, the y-intercept is equal to 0, which also means that this table is proportional. And we have a unit rate. My unit rate is times 2. The pattern is if I take negative 3 and multiply by 2, it gives me negative 6. I take negative 1, multiply by 2, it gives me negative 2. 2 times 2 is 4. So we see the pattern. If we can see the pattern, then right away we know that the y-intercept is 0 because this is proportional. All right, so you're going to have a practice to work on. Go ahead and make sure that you submit it when you're done. If you need to rewind, pause this video, rewatch it, by all means do that. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me on email or Google Hangout. And I hope you guys have a great day. Talk to you guys soon. Thanks.